Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on today's talk under the theme, the human right to water and implication for groundwater governance in South Africa. And my name is Nolwazi Shabangu. I'm from the Northwest University and I'm a second year master's student. And I'm also a member under the Groundwater Division, a young professional in the Northern Branch. Okay, then I'd like to take this moment and just welcome our speaker for today, which is Prof Viljoen, also from the Northwest University and the law faculty. So Prof Viljoen is an expert in the environmental and constitutional property law with a particular focus on water resources. She has published widely and contributed to a numerous projects addressing the intersection of human rights and environmental policy. Prof is dedicated to advancing the recognition of human rights in water, especially in relation to South Africa's ongoing challenges with water security and groundwater governance. Prof, welcome to our talk this evening, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Nolwazi, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. Colleagues, without further ado, let us start with our talk tonight. So quickly, I'll share with you my suggested outline for this presentation. I'm just briefly going to introduce, the Human Rights Day and the World Water Day that we will commemorate deeper in this week. And then also quickly reflect on why it's important to connect these 2 days for us in South Africa specifically. And then naturally flowing from those introductory remarks, I'm going to move over to this theme of water as a human right. So you heard, I'm a lawyer, so I'm definitely going to provide some legal perspectives. And then thirdly, I'd like to link this fundamental human right to water with groundwater protection. Because of the audience that I'm speaking to today. But then I would also like to talk about the law that's governing the groundwater currently in South Africa, and specifically on the gaps and the shortcomings that we've come across recently. And then I'd like to provide some legal recommendations at the end of the presentation. So just quickly about Human Rights Day. So on the 21st of March, it's going to be a public holiday in South Africa, and we all celebrate it. But do we still remember why? Why? It's not just a day off. It's a solemn reminder of our past struggles and a celebration of the fundamental rights that are really enshrined in our Constitution. And of course, the day also commemorates the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. This year, I see our government, you see that on the right-hand side of the slide as well, our government is placing a special focus on social justice this year, which of course really speaks to equal access to water resources. Then on the 22nd of March, we will observe another annual event, obviously to highlight the importance of water. And World Water Day was established by the United Nations actually in 1993 as an initiative to really raise awareness about all kinds of water-related challenges, including water scarcity, water pollution, unequal access, etc. But I think our country's history of struggle and also the ongoing socioeconomic challenges really make the celebration of both these days particularly significant. Because on the one hand, Human Rights Day reminds us not only of the rights we have gained, but also the responsibilities in ensuring that these rights are fully realized. And after all, freedom without access to something like basic water services is really incomplete. And true equality means ensuring that all people have access to, the essentials of life, including clean and safe water. water. But at the same time, World Water Day calls our attention to one of our country's most pressing challenges, namely water security and water scarcity. And as a water-stressed country, we must recognize that securing and managing this resource is critical for social justice and obviously for sustainable development. So by linking these 2 days, I think we are reminded that human rights are not just, principles on paper. They are about real access to clean and sufficient and adequate resources that sustains life. Let's turn to the law. Water is not just a basic need. It's a fundamental human right that is also recognized under international law. The right to water is essential for human dignity, health, survival, and without it, other human rights, including our rights to life, right to health, and to an adequate standard of living, cannot be realized. So internationally, this right to water has been formally recognized by the United Nations Assembly in a 2010 resolution, which explicitly states that access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water and sanitation is a human right. So this resolution places an obligation on states, including ours, to ensure that water is available, accessible, and free from contamination for all people. The United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that was issued in the year 2002 also defines water as essential for the realization of all human rights. And it also emphasizes that governments must take steps to ensure equitable and sustainable access. And along similar lines, the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 6, of course, also reinforces this commitment. So recognizing water as a human right really means that states must not only protect water resources, but also ensure fair distribution, also affordability, and then also sustainable governance, while they prioritize the most vulnerable among us. And at this stage, I think it's important to keep in mind that groundwater resources play a crucial role in realizing this right, especially in these regions where surface water is really scarce. As we narrow the focus from international law to more the regional and sub-regional perspectives, I think it's safe to state that in Africa, legal and institutional developments really reflect a growing commitment to equitable and sustainable water governance. And I make this statement despite the fact that there is no explicit binding human rights instrument in the SADC framework that actually enshrines this fundamental human right to water. The African Charter on Human Rights, 1981, also does not explicitly mention water at all, but since it has been interpreted to include access, at least. But this commitment towards equitable and sustainable water governance in Africa is really evident if you look at the cases that has been heard by the African Commission on Human Rights, Human and People's Rights. But although these are not binding instruments, they are definitely key regional, legal, and institutional frameworks. And like the African Water Vision of 2025, they recognize and promote equitable water access. Then this brings us to the recognition of water as a fundamental right in South Africa. So our country has taken really significant legal steps to ensure access to water. And it began so by providing constitutional protection. Section 27 of the Constitution explicitly recognizes access to sufficient water as a basic human right in our Bill of Rights. However, while this right is guaranteed, the Constitution does not define the exact volume or quality of water that is required to meet this standard of, let's say, sufficiency. So to give effect or content to this right of water, the Water Services Act of 1997 perhaps provide more clarity. So Section 3 of the Water Services Act entitles everyone to a basic water supply, ensuring access to water that's necessary for human health and also hygiene. And this act further defines the concept of basic water supply. And it does so by stating it, defining it as the minimum standard of water services required to sustain life and to maintain hygiene. And to implement this, water regulations were published in the Government Gazette in 2001, and that set clear minimum provisions for the content of the right to water. And this is 25 litres per person per day or 6 kilolitres per household per month of potable water. I think it's, as illustrated on this slide, the constitutional and human right of access to water in South Africa does not stand alone. It is embedded within a broader legislative framework that includes the Water Services Act, but also the National Water Act. And it's perhaps also important just to highlight that this human right of access to water has also been interpreted and upheld by our courts, with the Mazibuko cases, of course, standing as the most significant legal precedent in shaping the interpretation and the application of this specific right. So I think we are clear on what the human right to water entails. But it's important to note that this human right to water is not only relevant to surface water, but also to groundwater. And groundwater plays a fundamental role in ensuring access to water, especially in our country that is arid, as semi-arid regions, where the surface water filters are often unreliable. And groundwater really is a primary water source for many rural communities. It supports essential domestic needs, agriculture, industry, including mining. And unlike surface water, groundwater offers greater resilience against climate variability and drought. So it really makes it a crucial resource in adapting to climate change. So it's essential that we have a real robust legislative protection for groundwater resources, for it to be protected, to realize our human right to water. So how does our legislative framework look like that effectively protect groundwater resources? So from the outset, it's important to perhaps note that the law governing groundwater in South Africa has evolved significantly over time. It moved from a system that linked land ownership in the past to one that is now based on public trusteeship or national control. Historically, under African customary law, water was regarded as a communal resource accessible to all, and there was absolutely no concept of private ownership. However, this changed with the Dutch colonization in 1952, when the Roman Dutch law was introduced. So while its position on groundwater ownership during this time was rather unclear, it seems as if landowners owned everything above and below their land. So during this time, it seems as if the law at least suggested private control over groundwater resources. The British colonization in the 19th century further entrenched this notion of private groundwater rights, and they did so through the riparian system. They classified groundwater as private water, and this allowed landowners unrestricted access to groundwater on their properties, and obviously this led to over-extraction and contamination because regulation really was minimal. And the Water Act of 1956 reinforced this approach by maintaining this distinction between private and public water. However, I think we must note that the Water Act of 1956 did introduce a mechanism for government intervention, such as the ability to declare subterranean government water control areas to limit private water use. But in 1998, our water law in South Africa underwent a fundamental transformation with the enactment of the National Water Act. And this shift was rooted, obviously, in the Constitution, which enshrines our right of access to water, but also the right to environmental protection that we find in Section 24 of the Constitution. Allow me to quickly highlight a few aspects of the National Water Act that specifically addresses groundwater protection. So in the first instance, public trusteeship. So the National Water Act introduced this principle of public trusteeship, and it means that the national government holds all water resources, including groundwater, in trust for the people of South Africa. So water is no longer subject to private ownership. Only the right to use it exists, subject to national control. So this is obviously then a significant departure from the previous system where groundwater was largely treated as private property. Then the second measure in the National Water Act that addresses groundwater protection is to be found in the definition of water resources, I believe. So the Act explicitly defines water resources to include aquifers. And you all know what that is, geological formations that store or transmit amounts of water. But not all groundwater falls under this definition. Because there are certain water in the Videau zone, for example, that is then excluded from this definition. So this is perhaps one gap in the current water law, the definition of water resources. Then thirdly, we'd like to touch upon water use authorization. So Chapter 4 of the National Water Act regulates water use under an authorization system. Certain activities listed in Section 21, which could pose risks to water resources, they require a water use license. Unless, of course, they qualify under specific exemptions like a Schedule 1 use or existing lawful use or general authorizations. Then, in areas facing water stress or requiring some equity-driven redistribution, the National Water Act also allows for compulsory licensing. I see to date, this has been implemented in the Tosca-Mullapoort catchment for groundwater regulation. And then lastly, another significant or key measure in underground water protection is found in Chapter 3 of the National Water Act, as it provides for the classification of water resources, also for the establishment of a reserve, and also for setting resource quality objectives. And as I go along, you'll see in practice, I believe these measures have been predominantly applied to surface water, and then groundwater obviously often being overlooked. So while the National Water Act represents a progressive and a beautiful step in groundwater governance, the effective implementation remains a significant challenge. And the recent case of Kangra Coal versus the trustees of the time being highlights some gaps in the South Africa's legislative framework for groundwater protection. You'll see this is a fairly new case, a 2025 case. It was published in February 2025. And for those of you perhaps that did not follow this development, just a short and quick summary of this case. The case concerns a legal dispute between Kangra Coal, which is a mining company, and commercial farmers in the vicinity of the colliery. So Kangra, the mining company, they applied for an integrated water use license, obviously to conduct underground mining operations. But the commercial farmers farming in the vicinity, they rely on a couple of natural springs for irrigation and for livestock farming purposes. So these farmers objected to the application of the water use license, and they argued that the mine's activities would definitely reduce their water availability. The mine will contaminate their groundwater, and they also referred to acid mine drainage challenges, etc. But despite the farmers' concerns, the department still granted the water use license to the mining company. So the respondents or the farmers then appealed this decision of the water use license to the water tribunal. And the moment that they appealed, they believed that their appeal automatically suspended the water use license under the National Water Act. But after this appeal done by the farmers, the mining company or Kangra continued its mining operations. But nevertheless, before the tribunal could decide on the appeal of this water use license, the farmers successfully went to the High Court and sought an interdict, and the High Court ruled in their favor. So the High Court said that Kangra, the mining company, should halt all its mining activities. But then, that was in the High Court. But then Kangra, the mining company, then appealed to the Supreme Court of Appeal, which overturned the High Court's order. And they found that the farmers, the respondents, failed to prove that they would suffer harm. In other words, the court found that the farmers did not sufficiently argue that the nearby mining activities would negatively affect their groundwater to rely on. So the mining company then was allowed to continue with its mining operations. So I think this case is just one example that underscores the weaknesses in our legal framework for groundwater protection. And this case highlights specific gaps in our law. The case, and I think it's clear, reveals that while water users, particularly farmers in this instance, have the right to challenge potential harmful water use licenses, these people still face difficulties in securing their effective relief in the protection of groundwater. Then I would like to add that in an article that I've written with Karen Bosman, so I need to give credit to her explicitly now. The two of us identified several fundamental shortcomings in our water law framework. And these come from the article that Karen and I worked on. I'm going to highlight a couple of them first. Firstly, we argue that one of the most significant flaws in our water governance system is its bias towards service water. The tools that are designed for implementing the National Water Act, such as the Water Resources Classification System that I referred to earlier, and the establishment of resource quality objectives, they are developed, or they were developed, with surface water in mind. And these mechanisms rely on ecological categories that do not really adequately capture the unique characteristics of groundwater. So we argue that this oversight leaves aquifers and other subterranean water sources exposed to over-extraction, to contamination, and to long-term degradation per se. So that's the first that I would like to highlight. The second shortcoming is in regard to the authorization process, which was also highlighted in the Kangra case that I just mentioned. So the water use license application system does not sufficiently account for groundwater resources. Aquifers are often not properly identified or even considered in licensing decisions. Obviously, with a few exceptions, such as the listing of subterranean government control areas and also the compulsory licensing, our authorization mechanisms under the National Water Act fail to offer targeted protection of sensitive and socioeconomically significant aquifers. And this gap allows critical groundwater resources to be placed at risk, especially in the mining and industrial contexts. Another crucial issue we identified is the failure of protection mechanisms to specifically account for groundwater. And the concept of the reserve, which determines the water quantity and quality needed for basic human needs and ecological sustainability, was originally designed also only with surface water in mind. So as a result, groundwater resources that are already used for domestic supply remain unprotected. And then lastly, finally, and I think perhaps the most important one, is that we must recognize the law's failure to integrate water resource management with land use planning effectively. The white paper on a national water policy in 1997 explicitly acknowledged that land use regulation should play a role in managing water resources. But this recognition has never been incorporated, at least meaningfully incorporated, into land use planning instruments under the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, or SPLUMA. And this lack of coordination means that decisions about development, about agriculture, industrial expansions are often made without considering the impact on groundwater resources. And if we do not bridge this gap, we risk further degrading water resources that are already under immense pressure. So groundwater remains an undervalued and unprotected resource in our legal framework. But yeah, given its vital role, especially in South Africa, that is drought prone, it's so important for us to adopt a more precautionary and a robust approach to groundwater regulation and enforcement. So Karen and I argue that groundwater protection must be explicitly integrated into land use planning, but also in environmental impact assessment measures. So the first targeted approach that we identified, I think one of the most effective tools for groundwater conservation that has been successfully implemented in other countries like the UK and Germany, is the designation of groundwater protection zones or aquifer protection zones. So these zones would place restrictions on certain land use activities over vulnerable aquifers, and that will prevent contamination, obviously, and ensuring long-term sustainability. And South Africa has already seen some steps in this direction. The city of Cape Town implemented similar measures. But yes, these efforts really need to be expanded and formalized at a national level. How should these groundwater protection zones be defined? Well, we drew from international best practices. So we proposed that groundwater protection zones should be delineated based on hydrogeological factors, including well heat proximity, the extent of the recharge area, for example. Yeah, and when this zone is then defined within these zones, restrictions should apply to activities with high pollution risks. So activities would include, for example, agriculture-related pollution sources like excessive fertilizer use, or waste disposal sites and landfills, or mining operations, cemeteries even, wastewater treatment plants, and also informal settlements with inadequate sanitation infrastructure. So perhaps by implementing these zoning restrictions, we can proactively prevent groundwater contamination rather than reacting after damage has already occurred. So this might be a more effective and a cost-efficient approach. To ensure this groundwater protection in this manner, we advocate for two key legislative amendments. And the first one is to integrate these suggestions into the planning law. So to introduce the aquifer protection zonings into the South African legal framework, potentially through the regulations under the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, or SPLUMA, but then also perhaps to amend the EIA regulations to explicitly require the assessment of sensitive aquifers. To conclude, I think the human right to water is a fundamental right. It's recognized under international, regional, and national laws. But throughout, we see that groundwater is often overlooked, especially in South Africa, and it's really crucial that we improve our laws and policies to protect this vital resource responsibly. I thank you, colleagues, for your time.
Thank you so much, Prof, for the presentation. So I'll be opening the floor for any questions. Do we have any questions from anyone? Any hands? So, Prof, I will just go ahead and ask a question. On the Mazibuko case, could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on that case?
Yes, Nolwazi, let me do so. So the Mazibuko case specifically dealt with a household, Lindiwe Mazibuko, lived in Piri outside Johannesburg, and the city of Johannesburg decided to implement prepaid meters at their households. So this would typically then mean that Lindiwe would receive a specific amount of water, but the moment she exceeds that use, the prepayment meter will start, counting, and then she would have to pay for her water use. There were many technicalities that I won't go into, but the question really was, how much water can she receive before being billed for it? So the court had to decide what the minimum core, the minimum standard of water access would be. And then, as I alluded earlier, the court confirmed that issue of 25 litres per person per day or 6 kilolitres per household, but not without controversy, of course. There's still much debate on the Mazibuko case, specifically when it comes to austerity measures and also, the affordability of water. So the Mazibuko case stands out because it really dealt with the interpretation of the right of access to sufficient water and really what that sufficiency means, what is the minimum core. But as I said, I still have masters and doctorate students that's still debating the Mazibuko case. For us lawyers, it's fascinating.
Okay, thank you so much for the clarity. And I think another question that I have for you, in one of your slides, you mentioned the inadequate consideration of groundwater in authorization processes, right? And the first thing that came into my mind, which you also touched based on, is the EIA process. So would you say I'm correct then to assume that because there's inadequate consideration of groundwater in these processes, one can then argue that the groundwater consideration within our EIA processes or reports are then poorly considered, which then also contributes in the poor compliances that we get when it comes to groundwater.
I think it's safe to say so. Yes, Nolwazi. The areas that I've seen, I think it's the groundwater resources are undervalued, and I really think we can do better in that regard.
Okay, thank you so much. Just quickly note. Okay, I don't think that we do have any questions from the chat. Okay, I think we do have one from Megan. And I hope it's a she. She's asking, could you clarify why SANS 241 drinking water guidelines are not applicable to natural groundwater? Oh.
Megan, to be honest, I am not an environmental manager. So the science codes and so forth is not really something that I work with every day. So I know that this is recorded today. So I think I shouldn't say too much on that.
Oh, okay, Prof. Thank you. We have another question from Tapelo, and he's asking, what are Prof's thoughts on the timeline on water use license application to approval?
What are my thoughts about it, Tapelo?
Yes.
Yeah, what can we say? It's taking forever, né? And I think it's my opinion. You're asking my thoughts on it. I think it's unacceptable. I think what's even worse is what we have now seen in the Kangra case, where a water use license have indeed been granted, despite certain people objecting against it with legitimate reasons. And apart from that, these people went to the court for legal recourse for the protection of water resources, and still the Supreme Court of Appeal allowed the mine to continue mining and use water under their water use license. So I suppose that the implementation of our law, colleagues, is still in our hands, and there's still much to be done to improve the implementation thereof. But the timelines are really unfortunate.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. And then Albertus, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, I do apologize. You can go ahead and ask your question.
That was a perfect pronunciation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Prof. It was very insightful. One thing that I try to understand is, does the National Water Act supersede all local bylaws? And the reason I'm asking that is we've seen recently in the news, especially in Joburg, where somebody drilled into the Gautrain, that now all of a sudden drilling is called an illegal activity. And obviously, drilling is just a process to access this natural resource. But I don't see, other than dealing with the rights to water, which means that you've already accessed it, I don't see the point of access being addressed in the law. I'm not sure if I put my question correctly, but you know, to drill is one right. It's a town planning process, whatever, and then the next process is to understand the resource, manage the resource, and make sure that it's used and utilized in a sustainable manner. So basically, two facets, if in my interpretation, of how that thing will work. What's your take on that?
A very, very interesting and relevant question. I think you started your question by asking whether the National Water Act would supersede bylaws. And I think you're correct if you say that. There's definitely some kind of hierarchy. We see it's a general principle in the law and in legal interpretation that a national law will supersede a local law. And especially in mining law instances. So the drilling of boreholes is definitely a local bylaw issue, and obviously that will then have to adhere to national legislation.
It's just like, yeah, it's this one here. The other hand is sing. I'm not sure whether I am missing a hand.
I think Nicolette has her hand up.
Okay, Nicolette, you can go ahead and ask a question. Thank you.
I just want to add to the answer that Prof Germarie gave to Albertus's question on drilling in the Gautrain area. According to the groundwater control areas that was under the Old Water Act, you're not allowed to drill in the karst areas without permission. So in that case, it does become an illegal activity on national level. And then I want to say there's a question from Roger Parsons. He says, thank you for the interesting presentation. The law is reasonably clear, but implementation remains an issue. The key challenge facing practitioners is the time it takes DWS to process licenses. His question is, what recourse do applicants have?
Okay, thank you, Nicolette, and thank you for that, Roger. I think we have touched upon on timelines already, which is, of course, as we all agree, unnecessarily long. With regard to recourse, what can applicants do? Obviously, this is not legal advice that I'm now providing, but I can perhaps just say that there are measures in our law. And I can immediately think about measures within the administrative law branch specifically, where one, for example, has the right to inquire and to get some reasons for decisions being made. And the administrative law also provides for the fact that the decisions must be made in a reasonable period of time. So in terms of the administrative law, there will be a recourse. Other recourses, as in the Kangra case, for example, would be interdicts. Yeah, so there are a couple. I hope that answered your question. But the implementation, unfortunately, remains an issue.
Thank you so much, Prof. Do we have any other questions that we can quickly take before we conclude the session?
Thank you. You know, can I go?
Yes, you can go ahead. Thank you.
It's Robert. Prof, okay. Thank you very much. A quick question regarding that coal mine legal case. Would it be fair to say that if the farmers had shown harm, the court case may have gone in their decision? And that's in the context of the proposed mining, which apparently has now started in the Makadu area as part of the Makadu special economic zone between Louis Trichardt and Musina. I know that the farmers there have a concern. They have raised it. If harm was shown, do you think that court case would have, or that the decision would have gone a different way?
It definitely would have. So, and that's one of the big contentious issues in the specific case, because the High Court was convinced that these farmers or the respondents in the case did prove sufficient, harm on the contamination of their groundwater resources that they depend on. The High Court thought it was sufficient, but the Supreme Court of Appeal then argued that that's merely speculation and that they based their arguments that the mine will harm their groundwater resources on some kind of document that was submitted as part of the EIA process. So yes, my answer would be I think that they could have proven their harm better. The court case would have gone in a different direction. But then the question is, how do you sufficiently argue harm and future harm for that matter, right? But in any case, there's definitely ways to do that. I think we'll have to also utilize the NEMA, the National Environmental Management Act, in doing so. But yes, I hope I answered your question.
Okay, this will be our last question. Albertus, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Just on the Gautrain, just to put things clear, I mean, there's a servitude, and if you need to drill outside the servitude, that's not a karst area. But I get the point that Nicolette made in terms of the karst area. My question to the Prof is, in some of the other legal environments, because there's such a backlog in legal recourse or court dates or things like that, they've moved to an arbitration process. Is that something that that will work in a water environment where professionals can form like an arbitration committee or whatever you call it, and help with that? Because in the case that you're referring to, I mean, surely a groundwater model would be able to prove or disprove on a model scale that there could be harm to the farmers' water sources. But it's very difficult to explain that to a judge who doesn't have any groundwater understanding. So it's going to be a long court case. But I'm just wondering if an arbitration wouldn't be a process to help expedite all this long admin delays that one experience. Thank you.
So it's a very good suggestion. I haven't come across any examples of successful arbitrations in this sector, but the Water Act does make provision for it. So yes, I would argue that it can be a recourse. But the question remains, if, for example, water access is legal, let's say you've got a water use license, and it's contested and somebody appeals to the water tribunal, the question would then be, will that water use license be, will it stop being in force pending the arbitration or not? Those things I'm not too sure of. But point taken, I think arbitration is definitely an avenue that people can investigate. It's much cheaper, it's much faster.
Kutlana, you can go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for the informative presentation. I have a question that is related to groundwater protection zone. From my observations, and it has always been a concern that there's just so much wastewater that is dumped on the surface, and also with regards to the landfill sites that are just probably not regulated, if I can use that. If I can use that word. So my question is, what are the steps being taken to ensure that groundwaters is really protected, and basically what are the steps being taken?
I think one of the suggestions that we propose is to define or delineate these zones, right? As I explained earlier. And the moment that such a zone is then identified and declared, certain activities will be restricted on or near that groundwater resource. So your examples of wastewater or landfill or cemeteries, whatever, would then be, the use will be restricted on that land. So that's why we'd like to see these land zones being connected with planning law, with SPLUMA, to also regulate land use activities to protect the groundwater resources. But thank you for that question. I think it wraps up the presentation well.
Thank you so much, Prof. Pearl Mabaso, your question is observed. However, we'll just answer it on the debriefing session because of time constraints. And with that being said, Prof, thank you so much for the talk and for leading it. It was quite very interesting. And yeah, so right now we'll just launch the poll. And also the people who entered the meeting a bit late, please just ensure that you add your name and the organization that you come from, so that for your CPD points. Thank you.